Today we'll take a look at the range input type, which allows us to create built-in sliders. So for this lesson, let's work in jspin.com so we can more easily add JavaScript and HTML and see our output to the right. All right, so the first step is we want to add this input type. So we'll just do it like so for the time being. Input type equals range, and in browsers which support it, we'll get this nice new slider that we can drag to the left or right. Now we can also add a handful of attributes. So let's say that we want to create 3 sliders for red, green, and blue. And then based upon how we move those sliders, it will specify the color of a heading, just for something to play around with. All right, well, we can give this a min and a max attribute. So we know if we're doing red, green, blue, RGB, that the max should be 255 and 0. We have between 0 and 255 to choose from. Next, let's wrap these within a definition list, since we're going to have a term for each and the details. So the term, in this case, will be red, and the details, I'll paste that in like so. Next, I'll copy these, and we'll do one for green, and lastly, one for blue. Next, let's add a quick bit of styling, and we'll be sloppy here. Don't do this in your actual projects, but we'll just do a very makeshift form of reset. And then finally, I'm going to float the DT to the left, provide some padding to the right, and then finally make sure it clears anything that's above it. And lastly, maybe let's just add some quick margin bottom. This really isn't necessary for the lesson, just to give us something to work with. Next, I want to have our heading that we're going to manipulate. So we'll say tuts plus rocks. And now based upon how we manipulate these sliders, it should update the color in real time. So let's see how we might do that. Well, the first step is, when you're working with these new HTML5 input types, you never want to assume that the browser will support it. You need to check support, and we call this feature detection. So let's create a function here, and we'll call it supports range. And when we are determining whether the browser recognizes these new inputs, we usually follow a similar path, and that is we create the input. So we'll say var I equals document.createElement, like so. If you were doing this in jQuery, you would simply do something like that. But we'll stick with JavaScript for now. And now we are going to set an attribute, and we're going to set the type attribute equal to, in this case, range. Now, the final step is simply to determine whether or not the type of the input we just created is set to range. So what's going to happen here is in browsers that support the range type, we're going to call set attribute, we're going to set it, no problem whatsoever. However, in older browsers, or even current browsers, Firefox does not support the range input at the time of this recording. So when it does that, the browser is going to go, I don't know what that is. I'm just going to default back to a text box. And that's what we're doing right here. We're saying, is the type of the input a text box, or has it still retained the range type? So let's try this out and see what we get. Render. True, so we know Chrome does support it. However, if I were to take this code into Firefox, we would get false. So now, rather than alerting it, what I really want to do here is return either true or false. So now we're going to return I.type equals range. That will either be true or false. Okay, now we are going to say if supports range, only then are we going to progress. And that way we're not running all of this code when the browser has no clue how to work with it. Now, to keep things clean, it's always a good practice to wrap your code in a self-invoking anonymous function. So I will copy this and paste it in like so, and clean it up just a touch. There we go. So now this function will execute. We keep from using lots of globals. We create a function that performs feature detection, and now we are determining whether we can use it. So assuming that we can, the next step is we want to be manipulating this H1 right here. So I will go ahead and capture that. And we'll say heading equals document, and we'll use some modern techniques in JavaScript. Query selector allows us to pass a CSS selector in our JavaScript. Just be careful about doing this in older browsers. So in this case, we're simply looking for the heading1 tag. And I'll be sure I declare this at the top as a good practice as well. Okay, so now we have a reference to the H1 tag. We also need to have a reference to these 3 inputs. So I'm going to give each of them an ID and a name equal to, in this case, red, green, blue. So green will be ID of G, and we'll do the same thing for name as well. And then finally, blue ID equals B, name equals B. So we will declare those at the top, RGB. Name them really easy to understand. And now we'll say red is going to be equal to document.querySelector. and we're going to look for the input with an ID of R. And we're just going to repeat this for each one. That way we can latch onto each of their values, like so. Next, I'm going to attach an event listener to, let's say, the body. And we'll say body.addEventListener. And we're going to listen for change. And once again, we're using some advanced techniques here. If you want to support older versions of IE, you'll also want to do attach event, or you might be perfectly happy to do jQuery, where you would do document.body.on, change, and then function, like so. Anyhow, we're going to stick with JavaScript, though, as I said before. So when something is changed here, this is a simple project, so we don't even need to determine what was changed because we know it could only be the input. But when it does, in that case, we want to update the color of this heading here. And that makes sense. Whenever this is changed, we always want to update the color of the heading. So when that does occur, we'll simply say heading.style.color, and we're going to pass in red, green, blue. So if we were to hard code this in, and I'll set it to 255 red, 0 blue, 0 green, that'll make it red. And before we try it out, I need to make sure not just body, document.body. All right, so now if we switch it, you can see it immediately turns to red. So now we already have the functionality in place. We simply need to substitute the current values. And remember, when I slide one of these sliders, it will either be set to a minimum of 0 or a maximum of 255. So the middle would be 127.5, is that right? Now, if you'd prefer, you can also set default values, and that's simply by doing the standard values. So if I set it to 0, that will be pushed all the way to the left. And alternatively, if I set it to 255, it knows that is the last number, so it'll be placed all the way to the right. In this case, we don't need it either way. The only thing we need to do at this point is grab the values and substitute it right here. So what I will do is get rid of all of this, and then to grab the value of these inputs, we can do .value with JavaScript. So we could say document.querySelector with an ID of R, .value will be equal to whatever the current value on the slider is. So why don't we put these within an array, and we'll say R.value, green.value, blue.value, and then we'll join those together and separate them by a comma. And that's just an easy way to ultimately get number, comma, number, comma, number, comma. And I think that should do it. So now let's try it out. I'm going to move it around, and let's try some colors. If we have red 0 and green 0, we can set blue all the way to the top. That's easy. And if we take red all the way to the top and move it down, we have red. And if we mix red and blue, we get this color. If we bring in a little bit of green, bring down the red, we now have the ability to specify this color using native HTML5 range inputs.